evening. Welcome to a celebration of Nantucket Sound, or ACONS. It's our free educational webinar series. For those of you who are regulars to our webinars, you might be sitting there wondering, well, where's Audra and who is this guy? Audra Parker, our president and CEO of the Alliance, unfortunately, is not able to be with us, but I am excited. I'm happy to be your host for this evening. I'm happy for our guest speaker and this timely topic. My name is Peter Aramo. I am the Communications and Educational Specialist at the Alliance. And for those of you who don't know us, the Alliance is a nonprofit environmental organization. We're based in Hyannis on Cape Cod. Our mission is the permanent protection and preservation of Nantucket Sound, the body of water that lies between Cape Cod and the islands of Nantucket and Martha's Vineyard. Now, this is especially important. I'm going to try and pull up a slide here. Here we go. Especially important, let me see, there we go. Excellent. Because Nantucket Sound, as you can see there, although it's one ecosystem, oh, I lost it. There you go. Although it's one ecosystem, it is split between federal jurisdiction and state jurisdiction. You have the federal waters, you can see right there in the middle, in the center of Nantucket Sound, surrounded by those state waters that run 3 miles from the coastline of Cape Cod and the islands. The state waters are part of the Massachusetts Ocean Sanctuary System, and they are protected, but those federal waters, they remain open to development. So now you may be aware that earlier this year, the current administration issued a temporary withdrawal of areas from offshore wind leasing. While this directive includes the federal waters of Nantucket Sound, it's only a temporary measure. It can easily be reversed by the current or future administrations. So our mission to protect Nantucket Sound permanently and across all political landscapes, it remains as important as ever. So the Alliance embarked on significant community outreach to determine, well, what's the best way to seek permanent protection for this special body of water, and have for the last several years been pursuing a National Historic Landmark designation for all of Nantucket Sound. National Historic Landmark designation is, in fact, the highest level of historic protection possible. Now, we've been pursuing this 2 ways. One, through legislation called the Nantucket Sound National Historic Landmark Act, which would be federal legislation through Congress. And the other way we're pursuing is through administratively through the U.S. Department of Interior. So this designation would recognize Nantucket Sound as a sacred tribal site, protect traditional uses like fishing and recreation, and also preserve this body of water in perpetuity. Throughout this process, we have built a very large, diverse coalition of support with nearly 100 stakeholder groups on board. We have municipalities all along the shores of Nantucket Sound and throughout the Cape and Islands. We have historic preservation groups, chambers of commerce, tribal entities, environmental organizations, and many others who represent hundreds of thousands of individuals. So, at the end of the day, the Alliance is seeking National Historic Landmark designation to protect the Sound and recognize it as a sacred tribal site. So as part of that, we have been trying to spread awareness as to what makes Nantucket Sound so special. We've been hosting this webinar series since 2020, a celebration of Nantucket Sound, or as we call it, ACONS. It celebrates the historic, economic, cultural, environmental significance of the Sound. We've been lucky and have had wonderful speakers. Our speaker tonight, insightful, inspiring, joins a long list of guest speakers for us on many great topics. You can always go back to our website, saveoursound.org, and see any of our webinars dating back to when we started in September of 2020. This evening, I am happy to welcome Chris Gloninger. He's going to discuss climate challenges to the Cape and Islands, including Nantucket Sound. A little bit about Chris before he comes on. Chris has extensive experience in the fields of meteorology and climate science. His passion for meteorology was sparked by Hurricane Bob, leading to a career spanning over 18 years as a broadcast meteorologist in markets all across the United States. He's covered everything from hurricanes and tornadoes to floods and blizzards and nor'easters. He launched the nation's first weekly climate change series, earning multiple Emmy and industry awards. Now a senior scientist at Woods Hole Group, Chris applies his expertise in climate and risk communication, helping communities understand and prepare for the impacts of a changing climate. So after Chris gives his presentation, I'm going to hop back on. We'll take your questions. Feel free, as Chris is speaking, just to write in your questions anytime. We'll get back on for a Q&A section. Yeah, welcome, Chris. Thanks for doing this. I appreciate it.
Peter, thanks for having me. Can you hear me now?
Okay. I can hear you now. I got a little worried there for a second. Great. I'm gonna get off. I'm excited to learn about this. I always learn from our speakers. I'm excited about this. I'm gonna jump off. I'm gonna leave it to you. You can share your screen. I will be on to answer any questions. Again, I'll come back on later. So take it away, Chris. Thanks, everyone.
Thanks. Yeah, thanks for joining, all of you, and taking an hour out of your day to learn about our changing climate. As Peter mentioned, after 18 years in television, we chose, my wife and I, to come here. I grew up on Eastern Long Island out in the Hamptons. The areas are so very similar. Not a lot of jobs where I'm from, since it is a resort community. But here with Woods Hole Group, it has been a great career move for us, but it was also a great place to call home after spending times in major metro areas in the life of TV. So as Peter mentioned, I worked all over, and in TV, you typically go to larger and larger and larger TV markets. I started in Rochester, New York. I went to Albany. The big economic collapse that happened, they ended the weekend newscast. So I actually moved to Michigan for a couple of years before moving back to Albany, and then made a pit stop in Milwaukee, where I met my wife at the ABC affiliate. And then from there, I landed my dream job at NBC Boston. If you are local news watchers here across the Cape or anywhere in Massachusetts, you probably know that the long-standing NBC station was Channel 7, WHDH. I was brought on to help launch the new NBC-owned station, and was there for 6 years before becoming chief meteorologist at KCCI in Des Moines. And if you are up on some of the top headlines, it made international headlines. We'll talk about that in a second. But why I got that job in Des Moines was because of my climate coverage during my time in Boston. The agricultural industry is a huge part of the economy in not just Des Moines, but across the entire 99 county state. So it was very important for them to understand how climate change was affecting their day-to-day weather, using data, science, and technology to give that messaging, and doing my best to make sure that it wasn't a political issue. So just a quick screen share. This is, if I can maybe add the, let's see here. Share sound. Okay, so I think we're good to go. You don't necessarily need to hear a lot of this, but maybe I'll kind of keep it down in the sub-track. This was one of the first stories I covered during my weekly series up in Hampton, New Hampshire, right? This was a perfectly sunny day, no storm, no onshore wind. You can see it was as still as any still spring day could be, and yet it was flooding. So we talked about how these instances of king tide flooding were happening more and more and more. And it was funny, I covered Hurricane Harvey for NBC Boston, actually for all of NBC in Houston, Texas in 2017. And after that, I went back to station management and said, hey, we should be doing more when it comes to climate change, not less. And my management was a little bit skeptical. Do you have enough material to have a weekly series on climate change? And soon we found it was a little bit overwhelming. We had too much content. We need to prioritize what the big stories were. And then we'd have big storms in between where that would take priority. And this is a pretty funny story. You see this stretch here in Sandwich on the Cape Cod Bay side. We were there before a nor'easter. The house you see behind Chief Burke tumbled into the ocean. But what was fascinating is before the storm hit, and unfortunately with a virtual audience, it's tough to gauge your reaction, but I usually get a chuckle with this story. The house was listed days prior to the storm. And I took a screen grab on Zillow of the listing, which said, "Your dream beachfront home." And I don't know what it was that made me screen grab that, but I did. And the next day I found out that that house didn't survive. And it was what you saw behind the fire jeep. It was taken out during the storm. To the realtor's credit, he was on it the next morning. The listing changed from "your dream beachfront home" to "build your dream beachfront home." And they knocked $100,000 off the list price. So, you know, in covering climate change, it's clear that we need to be having hard conversations about where we do build if a storm takes out part of a community. Should we be building on the same footprint? And we'll talk more about that coming up. We covered things like redlining and how, even though the Fair Housing Act erased a lot of those fake lines, but that were very much there when it came to discriminatory lending practices, those communities are very much the same, and they have limited green space. Heating and cooling costs are very high. So that's how Black and brown communities are often hit harder in a changing climate than more affluent communities that have green space. So that was enjoyable. I spent 2 years coming up with stories every single week on climate change, and that was probably the most enjoyable part of the job. And again, Boston was my goal. I wanted to get to Boston. I went to Plymouth State University for meteorology. I wanted to get to Boston. It took me about 10 years of my career to get there. And then I got this offer from the CBS affiliate in Des Moines, Iowa. And they wanted me to come out and, as I mentioned, talk about climate change because of the agricultural community. My time was cut short. And unfortunately, these headlines really don't tell the entire story. Yes, I got a death threat because of it. One loyal KCCI viewer threatened to come to my house with zip ties and weapons to shut me up. Even after his arrest, it was still uncomfortable, especially for my wife. When I work nighttime shifts from 3 to 11 p.m., it's hard to be home alone when you have this kind of over your head. But I will say it was the lack of station management support that was the real driver behind it. They wanted me to stop doing what they hired me to do, and I thought it was unfortunate. And at the end of the day, I found the formula that could connect with a very conservative audience to show the science and facts and data. And even though there was this one viewer who didn't like it, the vast majority of people let station management know when I decided to leave that they liked what they were hearing, and it was a new way of talking about climate change for them. So that's how I came back here to the great state of Massachusetts, or the Commonwealth of Massachusetts. So a lot of us, kind of wonder, how did we get here, and how do we know what impact humans are having on climate change? And that's a great question. And I know there are some people that may see the changes, but are skeptical that humans are influencing our weather, influencing the extreme conditions that we're seeing, and influencing the records that we're now breaking that have been pretty much unprecedented over the last decade. But we're able to understand what's happening, or what's been happening throughout Earth's history. And it's through data, through tree rings. Tree rings tell us more than just how old a tree is. It can tell us what atmospheric composition was like up to 5,000 years ago, and some of those big forests out west that have trees that are about 5,000 years old. Ice cores, Dr. Majewski, who's pictured here, showing me an ice core from Antarctica. He's in his mid-70s. I would argue much better shape than I'm in. He can summit the tallest peaks and be in the coldest places in his 70s and manage to recover these incredible ice cores, which show us data that dates back to more than 100,000 years. So how much carbon dioxide was around 50,000 years ago, or 75,000 years ago, or 100,000 years ago? And then ocean sediment, another important data set, which shows us about 5 million years worth of data. So another elephant in the room, you might hear, I had COVID 3 weeks ago, and for some reason I still have this cough and congestion. So my apologies for sounding a bit off this evening. All right, so we looked at the ice cores and how we can construct the graph that you see on the right-hand side. So that is carbon dioxide over the last 800,000 years. Now, if you look at the right-hand side of the graph, notice that line goes almost vertical. That's why we're concerned, because over time, we've seen these periods where carbon dioxide has fluctuated. It's gone up, it's gone down. We've had natural variability. But this goes beyond that. And if you look at the graph on the left from NASA, that's the global temperature anomaly. If you look at what temperatures were like back in the Industrial Revolution, for example, that's our baseline. How did temperatures after that compare to that average that we look at? And if you look at this graph, and what's pretty concerning is that last red ring was this past year, the hottest year on record globally. And we were over 1.5 degrees Celsius above average. And a lot of people that are skeptical say, hey, what's the big deal? It can be 90 one day and 50 the next. That's a big temperature swing. But think of it like the human body, and think of the earth as the human body. When you have a temperature or a fever, and you sustain that fever for days on end, right? So if you're at 98.7 degrees is normal, you're running 101 degree fever, 101.5, which is that range where we're currently at for days, what happens? Well, your organs start shutting down, right? You start to hallucinate, you lose brain function, and eventually you die. And that is what I talk to people. You can't look at weather swings. You got to understand the difference. Climate is the warming and how it compares to that long-term average. So it's Earth essentially running a fever for multiple decades, and that does have a major impact on the ecosystems right here on Cape Cod. Why we love this place is truly in jeopardy because of some of these changes, and we'll talk about more of that. So that graph on the right, a closer zoomed in image of that is what you're seeing on the left. And we'll take it from the Industrial Revolution on. And I love interactive talks, and unfortunately, that's the downside to doing it virtually. But if you look at the two variables that are plotted here on this graph, you look at carbon dioxide and you look at temperature. Now, the carbon dioxide line has been pretty steadily going up, and then it's been accelerating, right, post-industrial revolution. The temperature goes up and down year to year, sometimes decade to decade. Now, that is what we call natural variability. That's, if you're a weather buff or weather enthusiast, you may have heard the terms El Nino, La Nino, NAO, AO. Those are global patterns, and that's what drives the temperatures day to day, year to year, season to season. And that's the fluctuations that you see. But if you look at the general trend, this isn't just correlation, it's causation. And we'll go over that in just a second, why there's a difference and why we do know that humans are having that impact. But the general trend is for those temperatures to go up. After we had our little ice age pre-industrial revolution, we've been accelerating that warming pretty consistently. We'll be talking about the Cape in a little bit, I promise. But this is another graphical depiction, and I think that helps people see what happens over the last century to 2 centuries. If you look at the colors and how this kind of evolves over time, you look at that pre-industrial revolution baseline, which wouldn't be any shade of color. Blues are cooler, reds are warmer, and then look at how things start to change in the 90s, in the 2000s, in the 2010s, and then the 2020s. And you can see that it's mostly red, but you'll also see a couple of other concerning signs. And you might think, well, hey, Antarctica is blue. That's great. Well, why it's blue is what's concerning, and you have to look at the bigger picture, right? And that has to do with melting land ice. So that is what's cooling the water temperatures and that surface in Antarctica. So that is actually ice melt. And that's the same thing happening up in Greenland as well, that little pocket of blue with below average temperatures. So before 2024, 2023, when this graph was last updated, was the warmest year on record. So people say, hey, this is no big deal. We're talking about small variations, a couple of degrees Fahrenheit. It may go the other direction, but you have to look at the big picture, right? So I mentioned that early mini ice age, the little ice age. And that's why you see on the left-hand, side of this graph, temperatures that were below that industrial revolution average. When you look at what's happening post-1970, you're starting to see that trend where we've had 560 consecutive months where the average temperature has been above average. If this was just a natural variability, we would see months or years that would see below average or below that long-term average. mixed in with the above average. And globally, places like Phoenix, for example, and maybe if we have a couple of snowbirds on this call, Phoenix for the last 3 decades has not set a single record low temperature. 100% of all the records that were broken were record high temperatures. The global average is about 3 to 1. So if we had a stable climate, we had nothing to worry about. It would be for every record high, we'd have a record low. And look, our ancestors did a really good job in planning society around normal, but unfortunately, we're not keeping up with that because things aren't normal any longer. And that's, again, what we're concerned about. So for us atmospheric and climate scientists, we're kind of in this pickle, right? Look, the Industrial Revolution was an amazing thing, beautiful thing. It's why we have life on Earth today, right? It's why we're able to enjoy places like Cape Cod. It's why we're able to maybe the summer down here and make the drive from Boston down to the Cape without having to worry about horse-drawn carriages, right? So it was fantastic. And the problem is when you look at the big picture, scientists like myself, earth and climate and atmospheric scientists looked at every other possible cause for warming. We talked a little bit about the natural variability, and that was the graph that you saw. That was the ups and downs of the temperature, but the general trend is still going up, right? Volcanic activity. So volcanoes actually have a cooling effect. And that might cause you to scratch your head a second and say, well, wait a second, they're very hot, right? When they erupt, that's a lot of heat being released, and it is a lot of energy there. But what they release are little tiny particles called aerosols. Those aerosols reflect the sun's energy back out into space, and they actually have a cooling effect. So some of the biggest volcanic eruptions that we've had globally in recorded history, we had the years without summers, usually that followed because the sun's energy was reflected back out into space. So it protected us. It was that shield. And in fact, we've waited so long to act to cut carbon emissions. This is something that scientists are looking at, mimicking that volcanic eruption in cooling those temperatures. But you can kind of see, with MIT leading the charge and Harvard, there are other big institutions and some adversaries that have the same capability. So who has the ability to release chemicals into the air to cool off Earth's temperature? It's kind of a slippery slope. But again, not volcanoes, not natural variability. Solar variability. A lot of us, I don't know how many trips this past summer, we were able to go down to actually go up to Cape Cod Bay and see the Aurora Borealis. It was beautiful. We're in a very active pattern now. After a solar maximum, we're going back down. So after the peak of the solar max, the temperatures start to go back the other direction and cool off. So this warming has been going on well past 11 years. So we can rule that out as well. The Milankovitch cycles, that is longer spans of time. We're talking thousands of years. And that also doesn't really track because if you looked at those CO2 levels over the last 800,000 years, we can see those ice ages and how they interact with the planet. And that doesn't really line up either. So the fact that the Earth's orbit and tilt changes over time, we would actually see a cooling effect right now. If you look at previous ice ages, we're in the Holocene interglacial, which means temperatures should be going down. So why do we care? And should we be looking at how humans are impacting the weather? So that's the science of attribution connections or linking humans to climate change. And the easiest thing we can do, the easiest connection we can make is between extreme heat and a warming planet, a changing climate. So this scale that was developed through the National Science Foundation, Climate Central, a nonprofit, if you look, a -5 is conditions are almost impossible, even though you can see them across parts of Africa in this example, are almost impossible with the changing climate. But the areas of deep red, the +5, are conditions that you would never see without the human influence of climate change. That's the record heat that we're talking about. And that's the outpacing record highs to record lows by 3 to 1 on average. So the good news is, if you are, since this is an environmental group and up for preserving the Nantucket Sound, you might be in conversations with people that are skeptical. And I had a great conversation with a gentleman in Creston, Iowa. He liked to throw a few back after a day in the farm field, and he'd fire off at me and say, "Oh, you're full of BS," and whatever. He was in that doubtful category, so that 11%. But you can still have a good engaging conversation with somebody that's doubtful of the science. So we had this really early severe weather outbreak. The Gulf of Mexico, the temperatures, the water temperatures, what we would generally see in July or August happening in March. So I called for this severe weather outbreak days in advance. I kind of jumped on and said, "Hey, this is something we really need to be worried about." He said, "No one else is saying this. No one else is talking about this. You're an idiot." Well, his house wasn't hit by a tornado, but his town was that day. It was one of the earliest tornado outbreaks in recorded history in the state of Iowa. And I give him credit. He wrote me back and said, "I'd like to know more. I'd like to understand why that happened." And I explained how the Gulf of Mexico was extremely warm. In fact, the warmth was about 5,000 times more likely because of climate change. And when I announced that I was leaving, he said, "I'm actually going to miss your weather forecasts. I'm sorry to see you go." And it was one of the most meaningful conversations that I had, I think, with a viewer in my 18-year career. It's great to get accolades. It's not great to get pushback, but it's when you have somebody that comes out and says, "Hey, you changed my mind on something." You can't ask for anything more satisfying and gratifying than that. So if you're having conversations with people, about 90% of the population will at least listen to you and listen to the science and listen to why they should care. So going back to the attribution, well, what connections can we make? And I have great friends who are climate advocates that say, "Hey, that tornado was climate change." But I said, whoa, 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 not so fast. There are things that are weather. We had tornadoes 100 years ago. We had major hurricanes 150 years ago, right? The 1938 hurricane was a great example of that. But you can't rush to make those connections. The easiest connections we can make is less cold, more heat. Wildfires, another connection that we're starting to improve the science on, which we have a big risk here, the Pine Barrens. And I talked to some of the fire chiefs as a former firefighter myself, and they are very concerned about our Pine Barrens and what could happen, especially when we get into these drought periods. Less snow, right? Rapid swings between droughts and rainfall, less of confidence with what impact climate change has on severe weather. I gave you one example, but most day-to-day severe weather, not atypical. A hurricane going from a tropical storm to a Category 5 hurricane overnight, that is climate related, probably. So again, you're damaging the science and the work of the scientists if you say everything is climate change. And I think that that's important. So if you look at our risk, I chose 5 feet in elevation because that's a number during Hurricane Sandy when it comes to storm surge that we could have seen. And thankfully, we didn't. The storm tracked farther south and went into southern New Jersey. But if we saw the same kind of flooding that places like Western Long Island saw, like Breezy Point, parts of Staten Island, this is what would have been affected. There would have been 4,753 people on Cape Cod in Barnstable County, a lot on Nantucket Sound side that would have been at risk of flooding, with $5.6 billion of property, right? And there's 147 miles of road with 18 square miles of land that are below that 5-foot critical threshold. It's not a question of if. And I know this is such a cliched saying, but it's not a question of if, it's a question of when. When will we see a storm like this? And it's only a matter of time. What's interesting is for this part of the country, the National Hurricane Center never really modeled what Category 4 or 5 hurricane storm surge would look like here. But our waters now during the summer, which is great to swim, hey, we don't have to wait until August anymore to get in the water. In fact, I saw people in Nantucket Sound last Memorial Day swimming, which is kind of crazy. But those warmer waters, we do pay the price, right? It hurts the fishing, shellfishing industry. as species migrate away from this area, we open up vulnerabilities to things like red tide and algae blooms that we didn't really have to worry about or didn't have to worry about too often. We kind of set the stage for that, unfortunately. So the warmer water temperatures, great when you want to go in the water, but if you look at the big picture to what it means for the ecosystem and what it means for Category 5 or a Category 4 hurricane making its way up to Cape Cod, that's something we now have to worry about. And the National Hurricane Center has actually modeled that now, what that would look like here across parts of Cape Cod. And then across the Commonwealth, you're looking at nearly 1,000 miles of road, over 150,000 people that are at risk, with nearly $63 billion in property damage, or property value that is at risk. And as I mentioned early on, one of the first slides, when you saw that house fall into Cape Cod Bay, those are the conversations. And that's one of the ways that I connected with a very conservative audience in Iowa. I took things like fiscal responsibility, which is a very conservative philosophy. And I said, for every dollar that you spend on mitigation and adaptation, you save $13 in recovery costs. Excuse me, I'm gonna cough. That is fiscally responsible. In this country, we are now averaging $1 billion disaster every 2.5 weeks. And we give communities a blank check to rebuild. They can rebuild in the same footprint that got them into trouble in the first place. With fires, with floods, we're still not learning from our past. And that's what concerns me. And we are very vulnerable here. And while it's important to reduce emissions, and I think Massachusetts is doing a really good job at starting to switch that focus, we need to adapt. We need to find ways to coexist with the water that we love so much. You know, managed retreat is not going to be an option for everyone. And most of us have some elevation, right? We don't have to go too far away from the water and you gain a little bit of elevation. We have to be smart and we have to have some difficult conversations. And you can't let people build back in the same exact place and the same exact footprint with the same exact threat for storm surge. So that is my kind of call to action, that we need to do more as communities and look at the vulnerabilities. This is for not just Boston, but this is for Massachusetts in general. When it comes to our seasons, winter is warming at the fastest pace. And for our oceans to cool off, it helps them kind of build oxygen and take in carbon dioxide. And that's something that doesn't really happen as much or as frequently. And, you know, if you're out during the summer, well, chances are you're going to see ticks earlier in the season than you did or than you would have years ago, decades ago. And that's because we're not seeing those hard freezes or frosts that would kill invasive species. And those invasive species also are making their way up into our coastline as well. The green crabs that have found their way up here, which have caused problems to our shellfishing industry. So these are conversations that we really need to have, and our oceans are such an integral part of that. We're removing 26% of CO2. That's what they absorb. And our body of water is warming at a faster rate than any body of water in the entire world. That is from Cape Cod Bay through Nantucket Sound up through the Gulf of Maine. It absorbs 90% of the extra heat from carbon pollution. It's another reason why. And it provides food and jobs and recreation for millions of people. So that is why, you know, when I sit back and have a conversation with somebody that's skeptical, but yet loves the ocean, loves the water, and is drawn to this area for the reason many of us that are on this call love about Cape Cod, we want to preserve it, right? And that's the whole mission of Save Nantucket Sound. And I think understanding this climate risk of a changing climate, we need to have these conversations and find ways to make sure that we can sustain for many generations to come. So I think inland areas have done great with wind, and I think inland is really good for wind energy. So something some of you may not realize, in parts of Iowa, for example, we went from a house in Norwood when I worked at NBC Boston, to a house double the size in Iowa, and the energy costs were half the price. The farmers got $15,000 for every wind turbine that they had on their property. And it worked for them, right? It worked because it's a good space, because aside from crops, that land wasn't going to be used for anything else. So it's great to find those alternatives for wind, like inland locations. And our utility bill was half the cost of what it was in Norwood. And that's because it was energy independence. We were making it in our own backyard, which is really cool. So I mentioned terms and phrases to get people that are maybe more conservative minded on board to understand that, hey, it makes sense. It doesn't need to just be drilling for oil or using coal from coal mines. Energy independence can be solar panels and wind, especially the onshore variety of wind. And then the fiscal responsibility. What we've been doing in this country for far too long is totally fiscally irresponsible when it comes to letting billion-dollar disasters happen unchecked, unmitigated, not adapting to that threat. And we're seeing them happen every 2.5 weeks. So it's good to find creative ways. And as these billion-dollar disasters happen more and more and more, that is something that we're going to be seeing more of, which is concerning. So I do have one question, and I encourage you to try to make this as interactive as we can to ping me. So I just got one, Thomas Scott. If we could magically cut all CO2 emissions to zero, how long would it take to cool back to 1950s level? For each year we don't cut, how many years are required to cool again? Is there a multiple we could think of? That's a great question. We're talking about a couple of decades, so it's a little bit slow. And when we have carbon emissions now, what happened a couple of years ago to a couple of decades ago is already baked in. So unfortunately, it's like a ship, right? You can't just crank the wheel and the ship turns. It takes time to do that. But it would probably take us a couple of decades to get to that level, to get to those if we magically cut it. And I don't think we need to do it drastically, magically tomorrow, right? And in some areas, I think it's going to take time to switch off of coal and to switch over to something more renewable. Same thing with gasoline. So I think it is a great question. But yeah, it would take decades for us to get there. There are other good alternatives. What's something that's shocking to me? I was on a panel with, the chair of MIT's renewable energy consortium, and he said something that, now this was probably 5 years ago, that still is something that shocks me. He said that the technology to get us to net zero doesn't exist yet. So if you think about that, I think wind and solar are great, but we really need to be spending money on R&D, research and development. Fund that, find ways to get us there. Look, the first electric car, that technology was around the Industrial Revolution. And if you look and connect the dots between what happened to that and why we didn't scale up that technology, Texaco bought the technology and essentially buried it. So we've had this technology, but we need to just not keep on keeping on. We need to get creative and find these alternative forms to keep the grid going. And I think what he said was so impactful, that we're not at that point yet. We're not at the point of finding something that's scalable enough. Nothing exists to get us to net zero. And that's why our communities need to adapt to this. That's why places along Martha's Vineyard and Nantucket and places on the south shore of Cape Cod really need to look at adaptation, because of these changes. They're happening fast, and that change is only accelerating. So you need to kind of spread that money equally between mitigation, adaptation, and building resilience in your communities. So that is it. I said I'd keep 20 minutes for Q&A. I want to take as many questions that you have. And I don't know, Peter, do you want to moderate?
Hey, thank you
All
very
right.
much. Wow, Chris, thanks. I mean, that was, I don't know if you could see me here. Hold on.
I can see you. Hopefully everyone can too.
Great. Yeah, super insightful, thought-provoking, all that, and not only helping understand like the current changes that we're experiencing in the area, but just the bigger picture and the planet's climate history. It's just super fascinating. So thanks so much.
Great.
You mentioned the green crab, which is
Yeah.
fascinating because I know that kind of started perhaps in Maine, and
Yep.
now coming into our waters. Do you see any trends that in the waters, Nantucket Sound, and our own waters that are making it predominantly worse, year after year?
Yeah, I mean the fact that our ocean water temperatures are getting so much warmer than, gosh, anyone that's on this call when you were born through your teenage years, this has been a dramatic shift. So the other things I think that we need to pay attention to um, are things like flesh-eating bacteria that is new when you have those warmer ocean water temperatures, especially when you get into these periods where there's not a lot of wind and a lot of mixing. You can get these outbreaks that can happen. That happened in my hometown out in the Hamptons. We've had a couple of years recently where there's been flesh-eating bacteria, and the water temperatures are like a bathtub. Look, that's all moving north. It's all moving in this direction. So it's, best to be prepared.
Yeah. We got a question from Kate, and she
Yeah.
asks, where does nuclear fit into energy alternatives?
Excuse me. My apologies.
And thank you for doing this. I
Yeah.
know you've coming off of COVID and all that, so
All good.
so
All good,
you're
everyone.
a trooper, Chris.
Least I can do. Look, I think we're at the point where we need to look at all alternatives. And I think that, in some places, you don't want another Fukushima to happen. But I think that there are places in the country and that technology in the nuclear sector has improved significantly. And we're not talking about 3 Mile Islands anymore. We're not talking about those nuclear power plants. Those are long gone. They're safer, they're better. And I think again, we'd be stupid to just say, hey, we don't want to do that, right? I think we need to get creative. So I think it does have a piece. I don't think it's it, but I think it's part of the piece.
And an anonymous question here. Can you explain the 5-foot rule when it comes to coastal storms?
Yeah, so that wasn't rising sea level. So just so you're all aware, since approximately 1800, sorry, 1900, we have seen locally, so along Nantucket Sound, about a foot of sea level rise. But that rise is accelerating, and we could see anywhere from 3 to 5 feet by 2100. I use 5 feet not to scare people, but because that is a storm like Hurricane Sandy. Now, a once in 100-year event now by 2050 will likely be a 1 in a 20-year event. So we're seeing that frequency, the likelihood happen. So with that 5 foot surge, that 5 foot above ground, above sea level, I use as that threshold to show what's at risk. So that's simply as that. Will we see 5 feet of sea level rise by 2100? Hopefully not, but a storm could bring a 5 foot storm surge, and the southern part of Cape Cod is so incredibly vulnerable to storm surge, and we're seeing more of these sou'easters because of the storm track. With climate change, as the Arctic warms, and it shouldn't be, even though it's totally dark 24 hours a day, we're climbing above freezing, and that cold air actually comes down towards the equator. Places like Houston, you might remember a couple of years ago, had that ice cold and then snow in New Orleans this year. Well, that actually can take the storm track and shift it inland. So we get these sou'easters, which can devastate our shoreline, which we had last year, for example, December, and then the 2 storms in January. And if that happened closer to a high tide, we could have had that 5 foot storm surge materialize. So we're so close. We've lucked out so far, and hopefully we can keep that luck going. But that's why I use the 5 foot rule.
Got it. Got it. No question here, but Paula, this is great. She says, I just want to let Chris know that we still miss him here in Des Moines. I heard Jason say beneficial rain the other day, and I thought of you. As a person who grew up on the ocean in Newfoundland, Canada, the warming of our oceans is going to impact all lands, those on the coast and those here in the Midwest. Keep up the great work. Y'all are lucky that you have Chris over there now. So that's
Oh, thanks, Paul. A funny story. I'll give you this little
yeah.
funny since there's no other questions. Paula, I forget how we connected, but my one of my groomsmen for my wedding that I went to college with ended up being the chief meteorologist in St. John's, Newfoundland. And Paula let me know that they have embraced this American has come up, and he married a Newfie, and they have 2 kids, they're not moving. I don't know how they do it because they still show images of snow well into June and icebergs floating by. But they made an action figure of him, and Paula showed me that. I mean, that was so comical. It's such a small world, right? I mean, who would think? Who would think?
Absolutely. Bean asks, what can we as individuals do for the Cape, that's my dog, for the Cape shoreline? Plant more eelgrass, for example? You're on mute, Chris. Sorry.
Sorry. So yeah, I think eelgrass is big. A natural buffer is our salt marsh system, which we have beautiful, beautiful salt marshes all across Nantucket Sound. That's key because those salt marshes, and I think we need to invest in restoring the salt marshes because that is a natural seawall in a way. It takes the waves. You might get flooding, but it takes the waves and it attenuates that wave energy, so it breaks it down. So I think what we need to do here is focus on the nature-based systems by, more seagrass meadows like eelgrass, salt marsh restoration, working on dunes and dune nourishment. And I know a lot of people laugh at that and point to the case up in the New Hampshire seacoast, but I will say it did its job. It protected all of those $1 million homes. You may have invested $1 million in sand, but it protected all the homes. Right. So we need to do these natural things that I think work. And I think people have that misconception that when you nourish a dune, the sand just gets pulled out. But oftentimes it actually naturally creates a sandbar offshore. So the waves will actually break farther offshore, reducing the wave energy that makes its way to the land. So that's a great question, Bean.
And Marcia, she asks, is the Gulf Stream changing now and impacting climate change in the Northeast?
It is. The idea of it slowing down would be catastrophic, and I don't mean to be a doomsayer, but that is something that would be it would make places like England and Ireland uninhabitable. You wouldn't be able to sustain any agriculture there. It would be winter essentially all year. For us, what would happen is it would accelerate rising sea level. And I think people think melting ice is the only thing, but when our oceans warm, it expands. So some of the rising sea level isn't the melting ice, it's actually the water literally expanding out. So that's one of the things that we have to worry about is with that slowing, it actually causes the water to warm up a little bit more. There's less of that transition and movement of warm and cold water, which could accelerate sea level rise locally. So that would be worst case scenario. Hopefully we can head that off though, Marcia.
Got it. Now, Elizabeth, she asks, and you can't answer both here. You have to pick one. All right. Do you look more to cutting back carbon fuels or developing technologies to slow down global warming?
I mean, I think that kind of falls into the greenwashing trend. When I was in Iowa, the big thing was the carbon capture. And essentially, it's just storing the carbon down underground. And it kind of falls in line with who is the technology to cool the Earth's atmosphere through using aerosols, right? What if Russia did it? What if China did it, right? I mean, that's some scary stuff you're talking about. So I would still say the research and development needs to look at energy sources that are CO2 emission free. That's the bigger investment that needs to be made. Personally, I'm sure others will say otherwise, but
Bob says, given what you're saying about the southern part of the Cape, are the
yeah.
Commonwealth and local towns reconsidering their position on what we can do as homeowners to reinforce and strengthen our shorelines?
That's a great question. And I see a couple of my good friends here. It's funny, one of my first clients were a community on Cape Cod. I won't say who or what to respect them, but they've been clients that have become friends. They've been such a great group who've been incredibly proactive, right, in trying to tackle this. And what we've told them over time is we think that the permitting industry is going to have to change in order to keep up with our changing climate. It's not feasible. It's not our climate is changing, so do regulations. You got to find this common ground. And I think that there are going to be changes in the years ahead. That's a great question, Bob.
We have an anonymous person who asked if a young person wanted to be a meteorologist, what does he or she need to focus on in high school?
Math.
Oh,
It's funny. Yeah, it's disheartening if you're not a math person. 4 years of calculus, atmospheric physics, and thermodynamics. Um, but look, it's funny. I was not gifted at math, but it's something that if this high schooler is considering it and not into math, don't give up on a dream, right? And it's funny. I am actually the commencement speaker of my college, and I said, look, I talk weather and climate 24/7, 365, but being inspirational and giving it life advice, it's tough. But I think that that is an important thing. Don't let that derail you. If you're not into math, you can overcome, and you can make that dream materialize. And if you have or know somebody that is in that position, Peter, feel free to share my info, and I'm happy to mentor or help them out.
yeah, thank you so much. Yeah, and do you have your website? Do you want to just throw that out there?
Sure.
Yeah,
Actually, I can put my email right here, so
yeah, great.
anyone can see this.
Excellent. And I know Chris he's all over the Cape for the next couple of weeks. He's got a lot of speaking engagements. So thank you for putting us in there. Chris
Of
at
course.
weatheringclimate.com.
Yeah.
Someone else has chimed in saying Commonwealth Energy says they are only a few years from making a fusion generating facility. Do you have hope for that?
Yeah, look, I was at MIT's lab, and it was a project through Lincoln Labs and MIT. I don't really know how they're affiliated or connected, but they are. And I actually got to preview that. It was one of the last stories I did in Boston before leaving to Iowa. And they were almost there a couple of years ago. And I think that they're trying to create, they did it, they were able to do it inside the lab. But how do you go from that to a lab environment to scaling it? I mean, they are hell of a brilliant group of people. And like Dr. White, for example, I strongly anticipate that they will get there. I have the faith.
You have words of every time I hear people speaking about climate and climate changing, just positive words or words of hope that you have seen, or trends that have happened that where but I'm just trying to end this on a very positive note, and what we can do is as individuals for our immediate surroundings, and for far away. What's been hopeful for you as a meteorologist? What have you seen that gives you hope?
People showing up. People, every time I walk one of our beaches, I see someone picking up some trash. We do it. My wife and I are big on doing that. Look, when you do that and you understand the impact that you're having, when you tell somebody you're doing that, when you talk to them about maybe how climate change is a threat, so even if it's somebody that's a little bit skeptical, have those conversations. Look, I'm often asked, what are the things that we can do? And I think it's easy to say, oh, just get a EV, get solar. But I think really the meaningful climate action that we can all take is by talking about it, is by showing up at a beach and cleaning it up and working on it, and volunteering and being part of organizations like this that bring awareness to such a beautiful natural resource. It's critical.
That gives me hope. Thank you so much.
Yeah.
Well, I appreciate and certainly everybody who is on the call on the webinar. Thank you so much for being.
Yes.
I'm just going to shout out a couple of things. We do have a couple of summer webinars that you can register for on our website, saveoursound.org/ACONS. We have one in June. Libby Buck from the Linda Loring Nature Foundation. She is going to be with us on June 12th for songbird banding on Nantucket and the Sound. I know she's been, I think they just built a new banding station there at the foundation. So hopefully she'll be on site there, but excited about that. Any bird lovers there? We hope we see you online. Sign up for that. Then in August, we have Robert Rocha of the New Bedford Whaling Museum, exploring marine and cultural connections, Nantucket Sound and the Azores. So that's also very exciting, and we'll announce our fall webinars later this summer. Well, as always, stay in touch. You can write to us, Audra, who's not here, but you can always email her. She's always great at responding. If you want to know anything that you can do to help, or join our mailing list, you can email her at audra@saveoursound.org. And here's our address, our phone number, and as I said, our website. So that's about it. Thank you so much, everybody. Have a great rest of your evening, and hope to see you in June, and stay in touch. Take care.